Hi everyone, welcome to the reading guide for week 12 or MB211. We're going to be talking about contaminants, pollution, and human health this week, as many of you probably know from reading the chapters already. I'm going to cover a little bit about the basics of pollution, some different types, make sure everybody's familiar with the variety of pollutants that we can experience in our environment. We talk about what those impacts can be on human health, and then a little bit about how we test our environment for the presence and the sort of severity of those chemicals. So just a couple basics and definitions. When we refer to pollution, we're talking about small quantities of natural or synthetic elements and compounds that increase human incidence of disease and illness when released into the environment. And worldwide, we may see as many as 40% of all deaths related to pollution in the environment in some way, and that can be through exacerbation of natural asthma symptoms if you are exposed to air pollution. It could be ingesting a cleaning product, it could be taking too many Advil, or it could be something as insidious as being exposed to an industrial pollutant in your water supply. As far as definitions are concerned, contamination refers to the introduction of undesirable materials into water, air, or soil. Pollution is an unwanted change in the environment caused by the introduction of contaminants or harmful non-natural materials or conditions. A toxin is a substance that is poisonous to living things. A carcinogen is a toxin that actually increases the risk of cancer. And then I want you guys to be familiar with point source versus area or non-point source pollution. Point source is typically something that has a very identifiable origin, like a factory, a car. Your car can emit point source pollution in the form of carbon dioxide and other smog-producing chemicals, versus non-point source pollution. If you were talking about all cars in the United States, that's a very diffuse non-point source form of pollution. So is the ozone created when industrial pollutants at ground level mix with sunlight to create that kind of brownish, grayish smog you see in cities when pollution levels are really bad. One of the most insidious forms of pollution, and particularly in water bodies, comes from nutrients, like eutrophication type nutrients. We've talked about this concept before back in the early part of the course. We were talking about biogeochemical cycling and how when you have too many nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, these nutrients create basically a condition in which the limitation to growth of algae in a water body is removed. So you get a massive increase in phytoplankton that is called an algae bloom. The algae bloom, over time, those organisms only live for a period of time. So over time, when the algae start to die, they are then broken down by decomposing bacteria in the water body. And that is what causes these low oxygen conditions that are bad for other organisms like plants and animals, fish, turtles, things like that. You guys probably remember reading that story about the turtles and fish. That those low oxygen conditions cause those other organisms to not be able to survive, and they either move out of the area or die. The other kind of not so good thing about eutrophication is that it is often caused by excess nutrients from human sewage. So improperly treated sewage has a lot of nutrients in it. Our bodies are not very efficient at breaking down our food, so our sewage has a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it, particularly nitrogen. So if you have that excess sewage being released into a water body rather than being sent to a wastewater treatment plant, you can have raw sewage being the agent that's causing that eutrophication. And along with those low oxygen, high phytoplankton, eutrophic conditions, we see a lot of waterborne disease crop up. So things like cholera, skin disease, debilitating diarrhea. We see stunting of children's growth, all because we have these high sewage, high eutrophication, high nutrient, low oxygen conditions where certain waterborne diseases can thrive and other good bacteria are not found as prevalent. So we can test through the prevalence of waterborne disease through the presence of fecal coliform bacteria. So any of you that are taking NV211 lab, you've probably done some water testing where you've put water in a little tube and looked to see if it was red versus yellow for the presence or absence of coliform bacteria. Fecal coliform bacteria itself is not harmful, but it can be an indicator of the conditions that allow waterborne disease to thrive. So we use it as a way of testing for the conditions that would create a possibility for those types of diseases to arise. And in many cases, as you guys probably know from testing creeks around campus or here in Anchorage, fecal coliform bacteria is pretty prevalent in a lot of our water bodies, and we live in a pretty clean environment. So you can imagine what it might be like in a developing nation like India or Africa, where there is very little wastewater treatment, and we see potentially 80 or 90% of raw sewage going straight into the drinking water supply. Imagine if you knew that was happening here in Anchorage, that your toilet was flushing into Chester Creek, and then your intake for your water into your house was from Chester Creek, and that was the sum total of your wastewater treatment. It's a little frightening to think how many people in the world live in these conditions. Here's a little bit of an example. In the Yamuna River in India, it's considered to be a spiritual river for millions. But in this river, there are 3.5 billion liters of raw sewage, untreated sewage dumped per day, and 58% of all of the garbage, the municipal solid waste that's produced along the Yamuna River, is dumped into the river each year. The fecal coliform levels, remember, that indicate the potential for waterborne disease, are 100,000 times greater than safe bathing limits. And yet you have, as these pictures show, you have people every day bathing in the river. This foam here is the result of the water churning up industrial pollutants in the river that creates essentially a sudsy foam. And then, of course, mixed in with that are high levels of raw sewage. The city of New Delhi removes 1.1 billion liters each day of raw sewage, but that's still an increase of 2.4 billion liters of sewage each day. Just imagine what that is like. And these levels of pollution and poor sanitation kill 3.3 million people around the world annually. Most of them are young children who are much more sensitive to those types of contaminants. And this little figure here shows you the increase in incidence of cholera cases declared per country through time. So 1950s, 1960s, 1970s to 1990, 1990s to 2004. And obviously cholera is on the increase as we have more and more people, more human population, more sewage produced, less capacity for treating that sewage. Okay, so if that's one type of pollution, we could call it sort of natural pollution, and then it comes from sewage, which is a natural byproduct of human population. It's not a chemical, causes eutrophication, causes waterborne disease, stunts children's growth, causes deaths. The flip side of that is industrial pollution, which are typically some type of chemicals related to manufacturing. And these could be manufacturing everything from your nylon stockings to your makeup to petroleum products to our coal and oil resources. They're widespread. And these toxins are released into air, water, and soil. They're often considered point source pollution, whereas a lot of sewage pollution is considered non-point source pollution. But these industrial pollutants can have far-reaching impacts much beyond the point where they are released, in that they get taken up through what we call the grasshopper effect, or global distillation. They get taken up by the processes of atmospheric circulation that we talked about way in the beginning of the class. They get moved into these air masses, which are rising at the equator, and then circulating until they cool and then subside in those cells. Remember the Hadley cells, Farrell cells, polar cells. So as that air is polluted at the more populated areas of the world and the temperate and tropical areas, it then gets moved to polar areas where there is very, very little pollution and deposited in places like northern Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland. It can also get moved, say, eastward across the U.S., so industrial pollutants from Chicago and Detroit, big manufacturing cities, have turned up in acid rain that's affecting lakes in the Appalachian region of or the Adirondack region of New York, which is a very unpopulated region. Also, we see soil absorbing contaminants from different parts of the world, and then crop plants that are grown in that soil, wherever they are, uptake those toxins. Then we eat those crop plants. We might get strawberries from California that are exposed to contaminants moving across the Pacific Ocean from China. So these prevailing winds and atmospheric circulation can cause deposition of these industrial pollutants all over the world. And one of the worst places, believe it or not, is subarctic western Alaska and northern Alaska, where some of our Inuit populations or Inupiat populations have levels of contaminants in their blood that are far, far greater than any place in the temperate and tropical regions. So what types of industrial pollution do we have? Probably many of you have heard about heavy metals, or toxic metals. These are stored in our fat tissue, so they can lead to what we call high body burden over time. Because we as humans tend to accumulate fat through our lifetimes, these metals get stuck in our fat and we just accumulate them through time. So over time, the body burden increases. Heavy metals can have direct toxic physiological effects on our nervous system, such as behavior, IQ, and memory. They typically come from industry, automobile exhaust, particularly when we used to use leaded gas, which they still use in many tropical countries. And believe it or not, many of them are found in makeup. So be aware of that, ladies, when you're buying makeup. Check the label and see if you can identify mercury, arsenic, cadmium, lead in your makeup that you're directly putting on your skin. When heavy metals are released into the atmosphere, they can travel long distances, such that Arctic peoples in Greenland, Alaska, northern Canada have high levels of mercury in their fat tissue. I work on shorebirds, and shorebirds that breed in Barrow, Alaska, have really high levels of mercury in their tissue, even though they're not even eating things that would normally store high levels of mercury. So they're getting it from somewhere in that environment. And then, of course, it biomagnifies, which I'll talk about in a minute, through Arctic food chains, such that animals at the top of the food chain are more exposed to these things over their lifetimes than animals at the bottom of the food chain. Another major class of industrial pollutants are what we call POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. There's a dirty dozen. If it's not in your book, I can't remember if it is or not, you can Google dirty dozen and find the names of these contaminants. Some of them include DDT, which we know used to be used as an insecticide. Rachel Carson's powerful environmental book, Silent Spring, was written about this chemical. Polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, were used as liquid insulators and transformers. Their dioxins are used in herbicides, incineration of waste. When you hear that there's a waste incinerator in a community, one of the things that we would be concerned about in the smokestack exhaust would be dioxins. And then one of the big ones in this country right now is BPA, which we are trying to get out of our baby bottles or water bottles or toys, etc. PCBs are carbon-based compounds made in laboratories, and they were made in part because they're very, very, very stable. And small amounts last a long time in their whatever application they're in, like the liquid insulator, but they also, once released into the environment, last a very, very long time. Again, like heavy metals, they're fat soluble, so they bioaccumulate over time in tissue. And they can be passed on to children through mother's milk. And this was something I was concerned about as a nursing mom a few years ago. What am I giving to my perfect little baby who's consuming nothing but my breast milk? What kind of contaminants are in that milk that I'm giving her to eat? When released into the atmosphere, just like heavy metals, PCBs, and other persistent organic pollutants can travel long distances. For example, many of you have heard about Agent Orange, which was a defoliant used during the Vietnam War and also stored in Love Canal. There was an accidental byproduct that contaminated Agent Orange. It wasn't the Agent Orange itself, although that's not a great chemical either. But somehow in the manufacturing process, much of the Agent Orange used during the Vietnam War was contaminated by a dioxin. And that dioxin, when spread throughout the Southeast Asian environment, resulted in all kinds of rather horrific birth defects. And so eventually we stopped using Agent Orange, but it caused major skin irritation, cancers of the lungs, larynx, and prostate, and massive birth defects in subsequent generations, as evidenced by these somewhat horrific pictures. So what are the pathways to impacts on human health? There's two words that I've mentioned throughout this reading guide that I want you to be aware of: bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is where toxin levels accumulate within a given organism. So you or me or your dog or your sheep or a bald eagle throughout its lifetime, as it eats more and more contaminated food, the levels of those contaminants are then stored in that organism's fat. And so over time it increases its body burden of a particular chemical. Biomagnification comes from smaller organisms with a little bit of body burden of a chemical being eaten by a larger organism that eats many, many of those smaller organisms and accumulates all of the body burdens of those individual smaller organisms into its body burden. And this was first really looked at with a mercury poisoning case in Minamata Bay in Japan. And there was a PVC factory there that was releasing inorganic mercury to the bay. And it was thought that inorganic mercury was inert. It just sat there and didn't do anything to the environment. Turns out bacteria convert that inorganic mercury to methyl mercury. And that can be uptaken by things like fish and birds and the humans that eat those fish and birds. And so humans that lived around Minamata Bay were starting to have impacts on their coordination, their sensory organs, they had massive diarrhea, effects on their memory and recognition, and it was discovered that that PVC plant was actually contaminating the bay, the whole food chain in the bay, through these processes of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Another major class of sort of chemicals whose effects we're concerned about are called endocrine disrupting chemicals. And what happens in this case is that the chemical mimics a hormone that your body will use to affect a particular cellular response. And this can be either through turning on a cellular response through mimicking a hormone, or by blocking the action of a necessary hormone. And oftentimes these have sublethal effects on reproduction and development, such as birth defects, breast cancer. There's a potential link to obesity in that many of these endocrine disrupting chemicals alter lipid and glucose metabolism. So, for example, atrazine is one that's been in the news lately as far as demasculinizing and feminizing frogs due to the chemicals in this weed killer. So if it's doing that to frogs, what is it doing to those of us that eat food that have been treated with this weed killer, right? Something to be concerned about. The Alaska Community Action on Toxics is a group working here in Anchorage and across the state of Alaska to address some of these issues of military pollution and contamination in western Alaska. So you should check out their website if you get a chance. Okay, just quickly, I want to cover how we assess risk from contamination. So for example, in West Virginia in 2013, there were 2 major chemical spills in roughly the same region. And it prevented people from being able to drink their water, kind of a big issue, until they figured out what is the risk for people drinking this water. And the risk really depends on the probability of exposure. So if you're living in a house where the water supply comes from the Elk River, you probably have a high level of risk of exposure. And then, of course, we have to figure out the toxicity of the chemical. So we do that typically by what we call dose-response studies. And this is basically the concentration or dose of a chemical versus the biological response. And for most chemicals, they can be poisonous or contaminants at one level and not at another dose. And you need to figure out where that dose is that is dangerous for humans or for other organisms. So this dose-response curve is actually for alcohol. And we all know that at a low dose, we feel giddy, we feel excited, we feel happy, we tend to kind of forget our worries. Then eventually that depressant is enough to make us go to sleep. If you drink more, you pass out. Even more, you become unconscious. At some point, alcohol can cause death, right? So somewhere right in here is where we have a toxic effect of alcohol, right? Those of you in lab class, note that this past week we looked at determining the LD50, which is the dose at which 50% of the test population has died. This is a measure that's required for all new synthetic chemicals, not for humans, but for other organisms that we assume are stand-ins for humans. It gives us a crude approximation of toxicity, but does not get at sublethal effects like those found in endocrine-disrupting chemicals. In humans, we're looking more at the ED50, which is where the chemical first causes any kind of effect, and then, of course, the toxic effect, where 50% of the population shows some kind of negative impact. And this difference between those two is what we call a therapeutic index. And so we do these same types of studies for our drugs as well, where we're looking at, we want Advil to reduce our headache, but not cause other effects. And certainly, if there were another curve up here of the LD50, you certainly don't want it to cause death. Now, you have to think about the companies that are doing this kind of testing before they release a product. They want to make sure that there is an effect of the product, but they also want to get the product to market. So we have to be concerned about how well these tests are being done. I also want to sort of highlight why we use 50% more than 100% of any given test population for these tests. And that's because we want to make sure that we're not basing our assessment of toxicity on a super resistant organism that is really, really hard to kill. So we want an average sort of how many roughly are killed on average at normal resistance, and we use 50% as that mark. There are major factors to consider in determining toxicity in that individuals vary in their response even when given the same amount of the chemical. That sort of refers back to that superorganism idea. Many times organisms, even humans, have a threshold below which no observable response occurs, but then above that level there's a major response. And an example is the 2 parts per billion threshold for copper in salmon. Below that, we don't see any observable effect. Above that, salmon can't smell very well, and so they can't find their way back to their natal stream in order to spawn. So it majorly impacts salmon ecology. The effects of any chemical may or may not be reversible, so we may see over time that some organisms get better, others don't. And ecosystem processes can change the form of a chemical between when it's released and when it's uptaken, such as the methylmercury case, and that makes it hard to track and predict effects of some of these chemicals and contaminants. If there's one thing I want you to take home from this class, it is this chapter, this learning module here. It is the potential for pollutants in our environment to affect your and your children's health and well-being. And I want you to remember that for-profit companies make more money on products when they don't have to pay to dispose of waste or test products before releasing them for public consumption. Right? Those things cost money. So they make more profit when they don't have to do those things. It's in their best interest not to do these tests, not to prevent waste and spills and contamination. But this benefits only a few people that are involved in that company and shareholders of that company, and potentially harms all of the rest of us who are counting on a clean environment. We're all entitled to a clean environment, and we need to hold industry responsible for preventing and cleaning up pollution in air, water, and everyday products. And this harkens back to what we call the precautionary principle, which is better safe than sorry. Companies need to be responsible for releasing products that have been well tested and are safe for human consumption and exposure. And the burden of proof needs to be on companies that are producing these products, not on you or me to get sick and then try to sue a giant company with a lot of legal resources. And so we don't apply the precautionary principle very well in our capitalistic free market system, and that is why we have federal agencies like the EPA. It's why we have regulations, because it protects all of us that depend on a clean environment. Just want to make sure everybody understands that. Okay, this was a super long reading guide this week, but hopefully some of this information is valuable. Obviously, this is a topic I care a lot about, and if anybody wants to talk further about this, please feel free to email me or call me or come visit me in BMH 208. And talk to you guys next week.